She was the only woman who didn't want the Duke. Until a Christmas ball changed everything. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining us from, and subscribe if you love romantic stories like this. Now let's fall into this tale together. Snow fell softly over Mayfair as hundreds of carriages lined the cobblestone streets leading to Lancaster House. Viscount Edmund Lancaster's Christmas ball was the glittering event that opened London's winter social season, and everyone who mattered in high society had received the coveted invitation sealed with burgundy wax. Catherine Hamilton stepped down from her family's carriage, her gloved hand resting lightly on her father's arm as she adjusted the deep crimson velvet of her gown. The fabric was sumptuous and heavy, imported from France at considerable expense, pooling around her feet in elegant folds that whispered against the ground with each step. At 22 years old, she possessed everything London society deemed valuable in a young woman of marriageable age: golden blonde hair that gleamed like spun silk under lamplight, intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, a graceful figure that her mother's careful supervision had sculpted to fashionable perfection, and impeccable deportment drilled into her since childhood by stern governesses. Her family's wealth, though earned through trade and banking rather than inherited through aristocratic lineage, was substantial enough to open most doors in London's hierarchical society. Thomas Hamilton had built his fortune through 3 decades of shrewd investments, careful cultivation of business relationships, and an almost preternatural ability to predict market movements. He had transformed himself from a merchant's son into one of London's most successful private bankers, and his daughter would want for nothing, except, perhaps, the one thing money couldn't buy: genuine acceptance by the old aristocracy who looked down their patrician noses at new money families like the Hamiltons. But Catherine carried a dangerous secret that would have scandalized the very society currently greeting her with practiced smiles. She despised everything this glittering world represented. While other young ladies spent their days discussing the latest fashions from Paris, comparing notes on eligible bachelors, and practicing their watercolors, Catherine spent her evenings locked in her father's library, devouring philosophy texts that would make her mother faint with horror if she knew. She had read Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman no fewer than 5 times, each reading igniting fresh fury at the injustices women faced. She had consumed Rousseau's social contract theory, Voltaire's biting critiques, and had even managed to acquire, through considerable subterfuge involving a sympathetic bookseller and circuitous delivery, some of the more radical pamphlets circulating in intellectual circles. Catherine dreamed not of a brilliant match and a grand wedding, but of a life where she might travel freely, study at universities, engage in meaningful work, and be valued for her mind rather than her marriageability. She wanted to see the ruins of Rome, discuss philosophy in Parisian salons, perhaps even write under her own name rather than hiding behind masculine pseudonyms, as so many women were forced to do. But such dreams were as impossible as sprouting wings and flying to the moon, and so she kept them locked away in her heart, sharing them with no one. "Remember to smile, darling," her mother, Eleanor Hamilton, whispered urgently as they approached the grand entrance, where liveried footmen stood at attention. Eleanor was a handsome woman of 48, dressed in an elaborate gown of purple silk. She clutched her daughter's arm with barely concealed anxiety. "You look as though you're walking to the gallows, rather than to the season's finest ball. We've been so fortunate to receive this invitation. Lord Lancaster's support could make all the difference for your prospects." "Perhaps because I feel that way," Catherine murmured back, earning a sharp look and a warning squeeze on her arm that would leave bruises. The truth was that Catherine found these elaborate social rituals not merely boring but actively suffocating. Every ball, every soirée, every tea party felt like another link in chains, binding her to a future she didn't want. While other young ladies giggled behind fans over eligible bachelors, Catherine mentally recited passages from her forbidden books and counted the hours until she could escape back to the library. She watched the social maneuvering with the detached interest of a naturalist observing insects, cataloguing the complex hierarchies, the subtle snubs, the carefully calibrated displays of wealth and status that governed every interaction. The Lancaster ballroom was undeniably magnificent. 3 enormous crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings, painted with winter pastoral scenes, rosy-cheeked cherubs ice-skating across frozen ponds, snow-covered forests rendered in exquisite detail with real gold leaf. The chandeliers themselves were marvels of craftsmanship, each containing hundreds of individual bohemian crystal prisms that caught and refracted candlelight, sending rainbow sparkles dancing across walls and creating an almost magical atmosphere. The walls were covered in cream and gold damask silk, the intricate pattern shimmering in the flickering light. Strategically positioned Venetian mirrors in ornate gilt frames created the illusion of infinite space, reflecting and multiplying the images of elegantly dressed guests. The floor was polished Italian marble in alternating squares of white and pale gold, buffed until it reflected the swirling gowns like a still pool of water. Heavy velvet curtains in deep burgundy framed tall windows looking onto snow-covered gardens, and every surface was decorated with elaborate arrangements of white roses, holly with bright red berries, and trailing ivy. At least 200 guests filled the enormous space, the cream of London's aristocracy, carefully mixed with select members of the newly wealthy merchant class who had bought their way into respectability through strategic marriages, generous donations to fashionable causes, and patient cultivation of useful connections. The gentlemen wore dark tailcoats cut in the latest style, the expensive fabric and expert tailoring making each coat seem molded to its wearer. Beneath were embroidered silk waistcoats in jewel tones, emerald, sapphire, ruby, with gold or silver thread creating intricate patterns. Tight trousers in pale colors reached precisely to the ankle, and gleaming black boots polished to mirror shine completed the ensemble. White cravats were tied in elaborate knots requiring considerable skill, and every man wore spotless white gloves. The ladies were walking works of art, representing months of skilled seamstress work and considerable expense. Gowns in shades of ivory, pale rose, sky blue, lavender and mint green swirled across the dance floor like exotic flowers. The fashions were the latest from Paris. High waistlines emphasizing the bust, fitted bodices showing considerable décolletage, and voluminous skirts supported by layers of starched petticoats. Short puffed sleeves left arms bare, except for long gloves. Necklines were adorned with stunning jewelry, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, catching candlelight like small explosions of fire and ice. Hair was arranged in intricate styles requiring hours of work, decorated with feathers, flowers, jeweled combs, and ribbons. The scent was overwhelming: expensive French perfumes, fresh roses, beeswax candles, and beneath it all, the inevitable smell of hundreds of warm bodies in an enclosed space. The orchestra, 20 skilled musicians in an elevated gallery decorated with evergreen garlands and white roses, played a lively country dance, the sound filling the ballroom with melody. Catherine accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant, more to occupy her hands than from desire to drink. The bubbles tickled her nose as she took a small sip. She observed the room with analytical precision, cataloguing social dynamics like pieces on a chessboard. There was the Countess of Harrington, mid-50s, dripping in diamonds worth more than most families earned in years. The necklace alone probably cost as much as a small house. She was laughing too loudly, forced, theatrical, at something the Earl of Pembroke had said. The portly Earl, with thinning hair and a red face suggesting too much port, looked pleased with himself. Catherine wondered what bargain was being struck beneath the pleasant veneer. A marriage alliance between their children, a business arrangement. The aristocracy rarely did anything without ulterior motives. A cluster of nervous debutantes huddled near the refreshment table like frightened doves, their pastel gowns and anxious expressions making them look even younger than they were. They cast hopeful glances at eligible bachelors, young men who studiously ignored them or evaluated them with the cold calculation of horse traders at market. Catherine recognized those looks, had worn that expression herself during her first season. The desperate hope of catching someone's eye, the crushing disappointment when passed over, the careful pretense of not caring while dying inside. It had been exhausting and demeaning, and at the center of it all, holding court with practiced ease, stood their host. Edmund Lancaster was 52 and carried himself with the confidence of significant wealth. Widowed 5 years prior, his wife had died in childbirth, along with the infant E. Though few mentioned this tragedy, he had built a textile empire supplying half of Europe with fine fabrics. His warehouses held silk from China, cotton from India, wool from Yorkshire, linen from Ireland. His ships sailed to every corner of the British Empire, and his influence in commercial circles was considerable. He was tall, still reasonably attractive despite his age, with silver hair swept back from a broad forehead. A precisely trimmed moustache adorned his upper lip, and dark eyes had an unsettling habit of lingering on young women. He wore a tailcoat of finest black superfine wool, expertly tailored. His waistcoat was charcoal silk embroidered with silver thread. A gold watch chain stretched across it, from which hung a Swiss pocket watch he consulted frequently, as if reminding everyone his time was precious. Diamond cufflinks winked at his wrists, and a ruby stickpin held his cravat in place. Catherine knew him primarily through her father's business dealings. Thomas Hamilton's banking investments included several of Lancaster's ventures, and the two men had maintained a mutually beneficial relationship for over a decade. They had dined at each other's homes, discussed business over brandy and cigars, but Catherine and Lancaster had never been formally introduced socially. She had been too young during previous encounters. Dismissed as an unimportant child, she had caught his gaze on her more than once at events over the past year, and something in how he looked at her made her want to hide. Tonight, that would change. Catherine had been attempting to remain inconspicuous behind a decorative column, a massive pillar wrapped in ivy and white roses, providing at least the illusion of privacy, observing the dancing without participating. She sipped her champagne slowly, watching the patterns dancers made as they moved through a quadrille with practiced precision. The coordination required was impressive, each couple moving in perfect synchronization, ladies, skirts swirling, gentlemen guiding with practiced ease. It was beautiful in an abstract way, like watching a complicated machine in operation. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice when a presence materialized beside her, until a deep voice, slightly roughened by age and brandy, spoke almost in her ear, making her jump. "Miss Hamilton," the words were carefully enunciated. "What an unexpected pleasure to find you here, though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Your father and I have been business associates for many years. So I trust he is well." She turned to find Edmund Lancaster standing closer than propriety dictated, perhaps 6 inches separating them when there should have been at least 2 feet. A smile on his face was meant to be charming, but reminded her of predators showing teeth before striking. His breath carried the sweet smell of expensive brandy, and she could see the slight flush on his cheeks, suggesting he'd consumed more than advisable. "Lord Lancaster," she said, keeping her voice polite but noticeably cool. "A lovely ball. You must be very proud. Your decorations are quite spectacular." "I am indeed proud, though the ball is made infinitely better by your presence," he said, his eyes traveling down her crimson gown in a way that made her skin crawl. She felt violated by that gaze. "That color is quite bold. Most young ladies choose more demure shades. But then, I suspect you're not like most young ladies, are you? There's something different about you, something special." The way he said "special" made it sound vaguely obscene, and Catherine felt her stomach turn. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, my lord," she said carefully, taking a small step backward, her back pressed against the column wrapped in ivy, the leaves cool against her bare shoulders. "My mother selected the gown. If you'll excuse me, I promised her." "Come now, no need for false modesty," Lancaster interrupted. Moving to close the distance she'd created, he was uncomfortably close again. "Your father speaks highly of your intelligence. He mentioned you read philosophy, Rousseau, Voltaire, those French revolutionaries. Quite unusual for a woman." The way he said woman made it sound like an insult disguised as a compliment. "My father is perhaps too generous in his praise," Catherine said, looking past him toward the ballroom, hoping someone might rescue her. "I'm merely an adequate reader. If you'll excuse me—" "A dance," Lancaster interrupted, extending his hand. It wasn't a request. "Surely you can spare one dance for your host. It would be quite rude to refuse, especially given the close business relationship between our families. Your father would be disappointed if you failed to show proper courtesy." The implied threat was clear. Refusing would not merely insult Lancaster personally, but could have repercussions for her father's business. Catherine's stomach tightened with dread, anger, and resentment at being placed in this position. To refuse would be a severe breach of etiquette. Society would side with Lancaster. Her father's business relationships could suffer. She might be labeled difficult or proud, damaging her marriage prospects and her family's social standing. But the thought of being in this man's arms, feeling his breath on her face, having to smile and pretend to enjoy his company, filled her with revulsion so intense it was almost nauseating. Every instinct screamed at her to get away, that he was dangerous. "I'm not feeling quite well," she tried, forcing a weak smile. "The heat, you understand. So many people, so many candles. It's rather overwhelming, Perhaps if I could just have a moment, then some fresh air is exactly what you need, Lancaster said promptly, his hand closing around her elbow with surprising firmness, fingers digging in hard enough that she knew there would be bruises. The terrace is much more comfortable. We can talk there, away from the crush. It will be much better for your delicate constitution. Before Catherine could protest again, he was guiding her through the crowd, his grip tight enough to hurt, but not quite tight enough to make struggling obvious. She looked desperately for her parents, for any familiar face who might intervene, but everyone was absorbed in their own conversations and dances. No one noticed or cared that Catherine Hamilton was being led away by a man old enough to be her father, his hand like an iron manacle around her arm. The terrace stretched along the back of the mansion, an impressive architectural feature designed for exactly these kinds of clandestine conversations. It was constructed of Italian marble, surrounded by carved stone balustrades decorated with elaborate scrollwork. Enormous terracotta pots contained dwarf orange trees positioned at regular intervals, their dark green leaves and bright fruit creating spots of color. Glass lanterns hung from iron hooks, protecting candle flames from the winter wind, while casting pools of golden light separated by deep shadows. The music from the ballroom reached here muffled, romantic, mixing with the sound of carriages in the streets and the soft murmur of winter breeze in the garden trees below. Other guests dotted the terrace, a young couple near the far end, their heads close in intimate conversation, probably newly engaged, a group of 3 gentlemen smoking cigars in a corner, the tips glowing like fireflies, an older couple taking a gentle stroll, the wife's hand on her husband's arm. But Lancaster steered Catherine to the farthest, darkest corner where shadows were thickest and privacy greatest, where lantern light didn't quite reach and ballroom sounds faded to barely audible whispers. "Much better, don't you agree?" Lancaster said, finally releasing her arm. Catherine immediately moved to put the balustrade at her back, instinctively seeking barriers between them. The cold stone pressed against her spine, and she could feel her heart racing so hard she thought it might burst. That ballroom becomes suffocating with so many people packed together. All those bodies, all that heat, much more pleasant out here. "Yes, well, I've had quite enough air now," Catherine said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear. "I feel much recovered. I should return before my mother worries about my absence." She turned to leave, already plotting the fastest route back to safety, but Lancaster smoothly sidestepped to block her path. The movement was subtle, could almost seem accidental, but Catherine recognized it for what it was. Deliberate confinement. She felt genuine fear spike through her chest. "Why such haste?" Lancaster asked, his smile taking on a different quality now, something predatory lurking beneath civility, making the hairs on her neck stand up in warning. "We've barely had a chance to talk, and I so rarely get to converse with someone of your obvious intelligence and breeding. You know, Catherine, I may call you Catherine. After all, I've known your father for 15 years. We're practically business partners. Almost family, really." The presumption of using her first name without permission was a calculated insult, a test to see if she would object, an assertion of dominance disguised as friendliness. Catherine felt anger begin to burn through her fear. "I prefer Miss Hamilton, if you don't mind, my lord," she said, her voice firmer than she felt, "and I really must insist on returning to the ballroom. My parents will be concerned. You're so different from other young ladies," Lancaster continued as though she hadn't spoken, taking another step closer. Catherine backed up until she felt the cold stone against her back. There was nowhere left to retreat. She was trapped between stone and his advancing body. So serious, so educated. Most women I know care only for fashion and gossip, for the latest styles from Paris. Empty-headed creatures, pretty to look at but with nothing of substance. But you have real substance. You read books that would bore most women to tears. You think about important matters. Your father told me how you discuss philosophy and politics with him, how you have opinions on matters most females wouldn't even understand. His hand rose as if to touch her face. Catherine jerked her head sharply away. "Don't touch me." "So skittish, like a nervous filly," Lancaster said, but his hand dropped, not away, but to her arm again, fingers closing around it in a grip that was immediately painful. She could feel each individual finger pressing into her flesh, knew there would be purple fingerprint bruises tomorrow. His breath was hot on her face now, and she could smell not just brandy but also the richness of his dinner, roasted meat, garlic, wine, and beneath that, something else unpleasant she couldn't identify. "There's no need to be nervous. I'm simply being friendly. Surely you can allow an old friend of your father's to be friendly." He leaned even closer, and Catherine felt revulsion so intense it was almost physical, like nausea rising in her throat. She wanted to shove him away, to run screaming, but she was frozen by a combination of social conditioning that had taught her to be polite at all costs, and genuine fear of what he might do if she openly defied him. "A man of my position could be very advantageous for a family like yours," Lancaster continued, his voice taking on a different tone now, calculating, businesslike, as if negotiating a transaction. "Your father is wealthy, certainly. He's done well for himself, but he lacks title, lacks true social standing, will always be considered new money by the old families. I, however, have connections, influence. I can open doors that remain closed to even the wealthiest merchants. I can introduce your family to society in a way that your father's money alone never could." He leaned even closer, his lips almost brushing her ear, and Catherine felt her body go rigid with horror. "And you, my dear Catherine, you have exactly the kind of freshness, the kind of unspoiled beauty that a man of my age finds particularly appealing. Young enough to be molded, to be shaped into exactly the kind of companion a man of wealth and taste requires, educated enough to provide interesting conversation, pretty enough to be displayed at social events. We could come to a very mutually beneficial arrangement, you and I. I could make your family's fortune, secure their place in society, and you could provide me with companionship." The implication was crystal clear, and Catherine felt fury burn away the last of her fear. He wasn't proposing marriage. Men in his position didn't marry merchants' daughters. He was proposing something far more insulting, that she become his mistress, trading her body and virtue for social advancement. "Release me," she said, her voice low but vibrating with controlled rage. Every word was carefully enunciated, pushed through clenched teeth. "Now, this instant." "Or what, my girl?" Lancaster challenged, his smile widening to show too many teeth. His eyes had gone cold and hard. "You'll scream 'cause a scene. Destroy your family's reputation because a respected gentleman showed interest. Think carefully, Catherine. In society's eyes, you came out here with me willingly. You allowed me to escort you away from the ballroom. No one will believe you didn't encourage this. If you make a fuss now, you'll be the one blamed, not me. Everyone will say you led me on, that you were trying to compromise me into marriage, that you're exactly the kind of scheming, social climbing girl that fathers warn their sons about." It was a threat, velvet-wrapped, but unmistakable as a knife pressed against her ribs. In their world, his word, male, titled, powerful, respected, would always triumph over hers. If she caused a scene, if she accused him publicly, she would be the one whose reputation was destroyed. Society would blame her for being alone with him, for somehow provoking his attention, for not being sufficiently grateful that such an important man had noticed her. Young ladies were supposed to be flattered by the attention of wealthy, powerful men. If she rejected him, if she made a scene, she would be labeled as proud, difficult, ungrateful, everything that made a woman unmarriageable. Catherine felt hot tears of frustration and rage burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry, would not show him how frightened she was. She blinked rapidly, forcing the tears back through sheer will, and lifted her chin in defiance even though her hands were shaking. And it was exactly at that moment, when Catherine felt most alone and helpless and trapped, that a new voice cut through the winter air like a knife through silk. A male voice, but younger than Lancaster's, carrying a tone of lazy, almost bored amusement that somehow made every word sharper and more dangerous. "Lancaster, my dear fellow, cornering young ladies in dark corners now. Dear me, what a spectacular decline in already questionable standards. I must say, I'm almost impressed by your complete lack of shame." Both Catherine and Lancaster turned sharply. Leaning against the doorway leading back to the ballroom, posed with studied casualness that could only be intentional, stood a man Catherine recognized immediately, though they had never been formally introduced. Alexander Thornbury, Duke of Thornbury. Even in her agitated state, even with her heart pounding and hands shaking and mind racing with fear and anger, Catherine couldn't help but notice that he was striking. Not merely handsome, there were many handsome men in London society, but possessing that particular quality of attractiveness that made heads turn and conversations pause. At 28 years old, he embodied everything London society valued: ancient title traceable to the Norman conquest, vast wealth accumulated over generations, multiple estates across England, and physical attributes that seemed almost unfairly perfect. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with the athletic build that came from regular exercise rather than soft corpulence. His shoulders were broad beneath his perfectly tailored coat, his waist trim, his legs long and well-muscled from hours of riding and fencing. He had black hair that gleamed almost blue-black in the lamplight, falling in artful disarray across his forehead in a way that was probably more calculated than it appeared. His eyes were penetrating grey, not pale but a deeper shade like storm clouds gathering before a tempest, with subtle variations of darker and lighter tones that seemed to shift with mood and lighting. They were framed by dark lashes any woman would envy and set beneath well-defined brows that could convey skepticism, amusement, or disdain with the slightest movement. His face was marked by a strong jaw speaking of aristocratic breeding, high cheekbones that caught the light, a straight nose that somehow avoided being too perfect, and well-shaped lips that seemed constantly on the verge of an ironic smile, as if he found the entire world faintly amusing. His skin had the slight golden tone of someone who spent time outdoors, despite society's preference for pale complexions, suggesting active country pursuits, riding, hunting, perhaps even boxing. His midnight blue velvet tailcoat was cut so perfectly it might have been sewn onto him, following every line and curve without a single wrinkle. The fabric was finest quality, with a subtle sheen catching light as he moved. Beneath it, he wore a waistcoat of pearl grey silk embroidered with intricate silver thread pattern, representing weeks of skilled work. His cravat was pristine white, tied in an elaborate style requiring considerable skill, held in place with a diamond pin flashing in lamplight. His trousers were perfectly fitted, neither too loose nor vulgar, and his boots were polished to such high shine they reflected candlelight like black mirrors. Everything about his bearing, from his relaxed posture that nevertheless conveyed coiled strength, to that maddening half-smile playing at his lips, to the way he looked at Lancaster with an expression mingling contempt and amusement in precisely calculated measure, radiated privilege, power, absolute confidence, and the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. At this moment, those penetrating grey eyes were fixed on Edmund Lancaster, with an expression that managed to convey scathing judgment while maintaining the veneer of polite social interaction. Lancaster released Catherine's arm as though burned, practically shoving her away in his haste. His face flushed an ugly brick red, whether from embarrassment, anger, too much brandy, or some combination. Catherine couldn't tell. "Your Grace," Lancaster said, and despite his attempt to sound respectful, there was venom beneath the carefully modulated tone. "I wasn't aware you had taken an interest in supervising social interactions at other people's parties. I thought you had better things to do than play chaperone." Alexander pushed off from the doorframe with fluid grace, moving toward them with measured steps. Each movement was controlled, confident, as if the entire terrace, perhaps the entire world, belonged to him by divine right. "Oh, I'm not supervising anything, my dear Lancaster," Alexander said, his voice carrying that same note of lazy amusement. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to make his presence felt but not so close as to be overtly threatening. His smile was charming, urbane and completely false, the smile of a trained diplomat concealing his hand. "I merely stepped out for some air. The ballroom does become rather stifling with so many bodies pressed together, doesn't it? And I stumbled upon this rather interesting tableau. A gentleman of mature years cornering a young lady barely out of the schoolroom in a shadowy corner of the terrace, far from chaperones and witnesses. One might almost misinterpret such a scene, don't you think? One might draw all sorts of unfortunate conclusions." The threat was delicately phrased, but crystal clear. Alexander Thornbury possessed the kind of social power that could destroy reputations with a single well-placed word. If he chose to spread word that Lancaster had been behaving inappropriately with Catherine, if he suggested to a few key people that the Viscount had been taking liberties with an innocent young lady, Lancaster's carefully cultivated reputation as a respectable gentleman would be irreparably damaged. The old aristocracy might tolerate many things from their own, but they took a dim view of men who preyed on innocent young ladies, regardless of how wealthy or influential. "There's nothing to misinterpret," Lancaster said stiffly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, knuckles white. Catherine could see a muscle jumping in his jaw. "Miss Hamilton and I were merely discussing family business matters." Her father and I have extensive commercial dealings, and I was taking the opportunity of a quiet moment to discuss some matters of mutual interest. Ah, family business, Alexander repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them mildly amusing. He tilted his head slightly, that ironic smile widening just a fraction. How intriguing! And does such business typically require physical restraint? I'm not terribly well versed in commercial matters, you understand. Such things are terribly boring, and I leave them to my man of business. But I wasn't aware that business discussions involved. His gaze dropped pointedly to where Lancaster's hand still hovered near Catherine's arm. Such intimate contact. Lancaster's hands fell to his sides like dead weights, and he took a step backward, trying to reclaim some dignity. His face cycled through several shades of red, and Catherine could practically see him struggling to maintain composure. Your Grace is too young to understand the complexities of alliances between established families, Lancaster said, attempting to sound patronizing. There are nuances to these relationships that require years of experience to fully appreciate. Perhaps, Alexander agreed easily, that infuriating smile never wavering. But I'm certainly old enough to recognize when a lady wishes to return to the ballroom. And Miss Hamilton here. He turned his attention to Catherine for the first time, and his smile, still present, always present, softened slightly at the edges, losing some of its performative quality, appears quite eager to rejoin her mother. I believe Mrs. Hamilton was looking for you inside, Miss Hamilton. Something about an introduction to the Duchess of Pembroke. Terribly tedious, I'm sure. The Duchess is a crashing bore who talks endlessly about her prize-winning roses, but you know how mothers are with their social ambitions. It was an exit, a socially acceptable way to extract herself from the situation without causing a scene that would damage her reputation as much as Lancaster's. Catherine should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt irritated, because here stood the famous Duke of Thornbury, whom half the young ladies in London sighed over and embroidered into their daydreams, notorious for changing mistresses as frequently as other men changed cravats, whose greatest talent seemed to be charming people while never taking anything seriously, treating her like some helpless damsel requiring rescue, as though she were a character in a fairy tale, a princess locked in a tower waiting for a prince to save her, as though she were incapable of handling the situation herself, too fragile and feminine to extract herself from difficulty without masculine intervention. Yes, Lancaster had cornered her. Yes, she had been frightened and unsure how to escape without causing exactly the kind of scene that would ruin her reputation. But she would have found a way out. Eventually, somehow. She was intelligent, resourceful, perfectly capable of taking care of herself. She didn't need rescuing, particularly not by an arrogant aristocrat who probably saw this entire situation as nothing more than an amusing diversion, a story to tell his friends over brandy and cigars. More irritating still was that Alexander was clearly enjoying this entire situation. She could see it in the gleam of those insufferable grey eyes, in the curve of those annoyingly perfect lips, in the way he stood there radiating satisfaction at having interrupted. This was entertainment for him, a game, an opportunity to play the hero and bask in gratitude. He'd probably dine out on this story for weeks, regaling his aristocratic friends with tales of how he'd rescued a merchant's daughter from the clutches of lecherous Lancaster, laughing at both of them. "How chivalrous of your Grace," Catherine heard herself say, and her voice came out cold enough to frost the winter air, each word clipped and precise. But I don't require rescue from an arrogant peacock who thinks the world exists for his entertainment." The effect was immediate and rather satisfying. Alexander's smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to anyone not watching closely, but enough to show genuine surprise. His eyebrows rose slightly, and something flickered in those grey eyes that might have been shock. Clearly, he wasn't accustomed to rejection or insults, especially not from young ladies who by all rights should be trembling with gratitude for his attention and stammering their thanks for his timely intervention. Then the smile returned, but changed, something more interested, more engaged lurking behind it now. The look in his eyes shifted from amused condescension to something sharper, more focused, as though she had suddenly transformed from a prop in his performance into an actual person worth paying attention to. "Peacock," he repeated slowly, as if testing the word's flavor on his tongue. "Creative, I must say that's a new one, though I believe my tailor would be deeply offended. He works very hard to make me look less ostentatious, you know. Spends hours agonizing over every detail. I shall have to tell him he's failed in his mission." Catherine then turned her full attention to Lancaster, and all the anger, revulsion, frustration and humiliation she'd been containing for the past 10 minutes crystallized into cutting, diamond-hard words that she hurled at him like weapons. "And as for you, Lord Lancaster, you should learn the meaning of the word no. It's quite short, only 2 letters. Gento. Surely even someone of your limited intellectual capacity should be capable of comprehending such a simple concept." Lancaster's face transformed completely. The mask of the respectable gentleman, the veneer of civility and proper behavior, fell away like a discarded cloak, revealing something much uglier beneath. His eyes went dark with rage, his mouth compressed into a thin, cruel line, and for a moment Catherine thought he might actually strike her. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and she could see the visible effort it took him to control his temper. "Watch your tongue, girl," he said, his voice low and threatening, vibrating with barely suppressed fury. "You have no idea who you're speaking to. No idea what I can do to your family with a word whispered in the right ear, a contract blocked, a rumor strategically spread, a business deal that mysteriously falls through. Your father's banking concern depends entirely on the goodwill of men like me. I could destroy him with barely any effort at all. I could ruin your family's reputation, make you all social pariahs. No one would receive you. No one would do business with you. You'd be finished in London. Think very carefully about whether you want to continue down this path of defiance." "Are you threatening me?" Catherine asked, incredulous at his audacity. Her fear had been completely burned away by righteous anger now, and she felt reckless, liberated, no longer caring about consequences, for refusing your revolting advances, for daring not to feel flattered by unwanted attention from a man old enough to be my father, who has all the charm and appeal of something one might scrape off the bottom of one's shoe after walking through a sewer." There was a strangled, choking sound from Alexander's direction. When Catherine glanced briefly at him, she saw that he was trying, and completely failing, to contain laughter. One hand was pressed hard against his mouth, his shoulders were shaking with the effort of suppression, and his eyes were bright with unholy amusement. He looked like a man trying desperately not to burst out laughing during a solemn church service. This somehow made everything worse. He was being entertained. This entire situation, her fear, Lancaster's threats, her desperate defiance, was all just amusing theatre for him, something to break up the tedium of another boring social event. "Both of you," she said, her voice rising slightly in volume as her control finally slipped, years of carefully maintained propriety crumbling away, "represent everything that is wrong with this society. Men who think the world exists for your entertainment and personal gratification, who see women as objects to be conquered, manipulated, or rescued according to your convenience, as though we don't have minds of our own, thoughts of our own, desires and dreams beyond being decorative accessories to male ambitions." She turned specifically to Alexander, and her green eyes blazed with fury. "And you, Your Grace, with your pretty face and expensive clothes and your reputation as a libertine who goes through women like a man going through a deck of cards, you're no better than him. You're simply younger and more attractive, so society forgives your transgressions. Women fall at your feet and you step over them without a second thought. But fundamentally, you're the same as Lancaster. A man who's never taken anything seriously in his entire privileged life because he's never had to, who's never faced a single genuine hardship or consequence, who sees other people as pieces on a board, as characters in a play staged for your amusement, existing solely for your entertainment and ego gratification." Alexander's smile had vanished completely now. He watched her with an intensity that was almost unsettling, as though truly seeing her for the first time, as though she had just transformed from a pleasant but forgettable background figure into a person of genuine interest. "Interesting analysis," he said quietly, his tone more serious than it had been all evening. "And completely unfair, I should add. You don't know me at all, Miss Hamilton, but interesting nonetheless." "Unfair," Catherine laughed, a harsh sound without any real humor in it. "You appeared here playing the hero, showing off, expecting what? My eternal gratitude, adoring glances and stammered thanks. A reputation as the gallant duke who rescued the helpless damsel. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not like the other ladies who swoon at your feet for a smile and a kind word. I don't require rescue, and I certainly don't require anything from you except that you leave me alone." "That," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that she couldn't quite identify. It sounded almost like respect. is becoming painfully obvious. And for the record, I didn't come out here expecting gratitude or anything else, but we can discuss that later if you'd like. Lancaster, who had been silent during this exchange, watching them both with eyes that glittered with cold fury, recovered enough to speak. When he did, his voice was loaded with something that was equal parts threat and dark promise. "You will regret this, girl," he said softly, but there was steel beneath the quiet words, making them more menacing than if he'd shouted, "This night." These words, humiliating me in this manner. No one speaks to me this way. No one refuses me and escapes the consequences. I'll make certain of that. I'll make you regret every word that came out of your impertinent mouth. His eyes narrowed to slits as he looked between Catherine and Alexander. Both of you will learn that I'm not a man to be trifled with. I have a long memory and considerable resources. Enjoy your evening while you can. He turned then, his footsteps heavy and deliberate on the terrace stones, as he stalked back toward the ballroom, his rigid posture radiating barely contained rage. He didn't look back, but Catherine could feel the malevolence radiating from him like heat from a fire, leaving a sense of foreboding in his wake that made her shiver despite her defiance. Catherine and Alexander remained in the darkened corner for a long moment, silence heavy and strange between them. From the ballroom the music continued, a cheerful waltz that contrasted bizarrely with the tension and implied threats of the past few minutes. Catherine could hear laughter, conversation, the sounds of people enjoying themselves, all of it feeling surreal and disconnected from what had just transpired on this shadowy terrace. Alexander was the first to speak, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Well," he said, and his tone was different now, more serious, less performative, as though he'd dropped whatever mask he'd been wearing. "That was certainly something. Not at all how I expected this evening to unfold." Catherine crossed her arms defensively, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline that had sustained her outburst began to drain away, leaving her feeling shaky and slightly sick. Her hands were trembling visibly, and she clasped them tightly together to hide the tremor. "If you came here expecting gratitude or some kind of acknowledgement," she began, her voice not quite as steady as she would have liked. "Actually," he interrupted gently, "I came because I saw Lancaster practically dragging you out here, and you looked distinctly unhappy about it. I thought you might want an interruption. Perhaps I was wrong about that." He paused, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes. "But clearly you had everything under control. My assistance was as necessary as, well, as a peacock in a garden, I suppose. Decorative, but ultimately pointless." There was a touch of humor in his voice, but not the cruel or mocking kind. It was more self-deprecating than she had expected, suggesting an ability to laugh at himself that she wouldn't have predicted from his reputation. Catherine observed him suspiciously, looking for the trick, the manipulation, the hidden agenda. But all she saw was a man, yes, absurdly handsome, yes, clearly accustomed to getting whatever he wanted through charm and privilege, but also someone who seemed genuinely chastened by her words, almost thoughtful. She began, then stopped. What should she say? Apologize? She had nothing to apologize for. She had told the truth, or at least her perception of it. "Thank you for the intervention," she finally forced herself to say, the words coming out stiff and awkward. "Even if it wasn't strictly necessary, Lancaster is a vile man." "On that we are in complete agreement," Alexander said, "though I should warn you, and I'm being entirely serious now, he doesn't make empty threats. Edmund Lancaster is a man who nurses grudges. He collects slights and insults and perceived injuries the way other men collect stamps or coins, and he has the influence and resources to make those grudges very inconvenient for those who offend him. What you said to him tonight, he won't forget it. And he won't forgive it." Catherine felt ice slide down her spine like cold water, but she refused to show fear, refused to give either Lancaster or Thornbury the satisfaction of seeing how worried she actually was. "So what do you suggest I do?" she asked, hearing the edge of bitterness in her own voice. "Go back in there, find him, apologize prettily, and thank him for the honor of his revolting attention. Tell him I was overcome by nerves and didn't mean any of those things I said. Simper and smile, and let him think he still has a chance at whatever degrading arrangement he was proposing." "God, no," Alexander said immediately, with what sounded like genuine feeling. "That man deserved every word you said and probably a great deal more. The things I could tell you about Lancaster would make your hair curl. Business dealings that skirt the edge of legality, the way he treats his employees, his reputation with women of a certain class. No, you shouldn't apologize. But you should be careful. In the coming days, in the coming weeks, Men like Lancaster don't forget, and they have subtle, indirect ways of taking revenge. He won't confront you directly. That would be too obvious, too crude. But he'll find ways to make things difficult for you and your family. It was, Catherine realized with surprise, a genuine warning, real concern, not the performative kind meant to make him look good. He actually seemed worried about what might happen to her. "Why do you care?" she asked, genuinely curious now, her defensive anger fading slightly. "You don't even know me. We've never been properly introduced. Before tonight, we've never exchanged a single word. Why would you care what happens to me?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, studying her with an expression that was difficult to read in the dim light. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Honestly," he said, "I'm not entirely certain myself. Perhaps because you're the first person I've met in years, literally years, who has told me exactly what they think, without any attempt at diplomacy or flattery, without caring about my title or my fortune or what I might be able to do for them. You looked at me and saw an arrogant peacock." His lips quirked slightly, "and you weren't afraid to say so directly to my face. It's refreshing, even if rather humiliating to my pride." A small, almost shy smile curved his lips. "Most people in our circles spend so much time performing, playing roles, saying what they think others want to hear. It's exhausting and tedious. You, at least, are genuine. Even if your genuineness manifests as telling me I'm no better than a lecherous old man." Catherine didn't know what to make of this honesty. It was easier when he was just the arrogant libertine of her imagination, a cardboard character she could dismiss with contempt. But this version, more human, more self-aware, apparently capable of introspection, was more complicated and harder to categorize. "I should return to the ballroom," she said finally, suddenly desperate to escape this conversation and everything it implied. "My mother truly will be frantic with worry by now. She probably has the servants searching for me." Of course. Alexander stepped aside immediately, leaving the path back to the ballroom completely clear. But as she began to pass him, heading toward the welcoming light and noise of the ball, he spoke again. "Miss Hamilton." She stopped, turned to face him, waiting. "Yes, for the record," he said, and now there was a mischievous gleam back in his eyes, that hint of humor returning. "Peacocks are actually rather magnificent birds, you know. Proud, yes, perhaps excessively decorative, but also remarkably loyal. Once they choose a mate, they remain faithful forever. So as insults go, you could have done much worse." Catherine blinked, disconcerted by the sudden shift in tone and was that flirtation? She couldn't be certain, but it seemed like it might be. "That was completely inappropriate and presumptuous," he offered, smiling openly now. "Yes, probably. Almost certainly, in fact, but I couldn't resist. You look rather adorable when you're confused and flustered. Much better than when you're furious, though I must say you're impressive in your anger too." And there it was again, the charming man, irresistibly confident, who knew exactly his effect on people and wielded it like a finely honed weapon, the mask slipping back into place. Catherine felt familiar irritation bloom in her chest like a thorny flower. "Good night, Your Grace," she said coldly, turning on her heel and marching toward the ballroom door with her spine straight and her head held high, every inch the proper young lady despite the fact that her heart was still racing and her hands were still shaking. Behind her, she heard his laughter, low, rich, genuinely amused rather than mocking. "Good night, Miss Hamilton," he called after her. "I have a feeling we'll meet again." London society is surprisingly small for those of our respective circles, and as Catherine re-entered the ballroom's warmth and brilliant light, weaving between dancing couples in search of her mother, trying to look calm and composed when she felt anything but, she tried desperately to ignore the fact that her heart was beating faster than it should, tried to ignore the fact that despite everything, his arrogance, his calculated charm, his terrible reputation, the way he'd made her feel like a damsel in a story rather than a person capable of handling her own problems, a very small, very annoying, very inconvenient part of her was hoping he was right, that they would meet again, and she immediately, thoroughly, completely hated herself for that hope. Catherine couldn't sleep that night. Lying in her canopied bed, staring up at the ceiling of her chamber, painted years ago with pastoral scenes her mother had selected when Catherine was still in the nursery, innocent shepherdesses and frolicking lambs that now seemed absurdly naive. Her mind spun restlessly, replaying every moment of that disastrous evening over and over, like a theatrical performance she couldn't escape, couldn't stop watching, even though it made her stomach churn with anxiety and residual fear. Lancaster's damp hand on her arm, fingers digging in hard enough to leave the bruises she could now feel throbbing beneath her nightgown. His dark eyes crawling over her body like something she couldn't wash off no matter how hard she scrubbed. The barely veiled threat in his voice when she'd refused him, promising revenge in that soft, menacing tone that was somehow more frightening than if he'd shouted, and then him, Alexander Thornbury. The Duke, with his insufferable smile and penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see too much, to look past her carefully maintained defences and see things she didn't want anyone to see, things she barely acknowledged to herself. Catherine turned over in bed, punching her pillow as if it were personally responsible for her confusion and the tumult of emotions churning in her chest. Why had she been so aggressive with him? So unnecessarily rude and confrontational. Yes, he was arrogant. That much was obvious from the way he carried himself, the way he smiled as if the entire world existed for his amusement. Yes, he clearly enjoyed the situation, had probably found the whole confrontation entertaining, in a way that made her want to throw something at his handsome, smug face. But he had also intervened when she genuinely needed help, even if she'd never admit that aloud, even if it killed her to acknowledge it, even if the very thought made her pride rebel. And that conversation after Lancaster left, when he'd dropped his performative charm for just a moment, when he'd seemed almost vulnerable, almost human beneath all that aristocratic polish. "Stop!" Catherine whispered fiercely to herself in the darkness, pulling her blankets up to her chin as if they could protect her from her own traitorous thoughts. "Stop thinking about him. He's exactly the kind of man you despise. Superficial, privileged, someone who's never had to work for anything in his entire life, never struggled, never wanted for anything. Probably already forgotten your name by now, moved on to the next amusing diversion." But even as she thought it, trying to convince herself, she remembered how he'd looked at her in those final moments on the terrace, not with the casual, dismissive amusement she would have expected, but with something else, as if she were a puzzle he wanted to solve, as if she were interesting, worth his attention for reasons beyond the temporary amusement of the situation, beyond the novelty of being insulted by a merchant's daughter. Catherine punched the pillow again, harder this time, frustrated with herself and her completely traitorous, utterly unreasonable thoughts. She finally fell asleep as dawn was breaking over London, the winter sun sending weak rays through her curtains, and her dreams were confused and deeply unsettling. Ballrooms that stretched into infinity, grey eyes that followed her wherever she went, and the persistent nagging feeling that something terrible was about to happen, that the consequences of tonight's confrontation were only beginning to unfold like a slow-moving catastrophe she was powerless to prevent. After 8 days had passed since the Christmas ball, the social destruction Lancaster had promised became impossible to ignore or dismiss as mere coincidence or temporary displeasure. The change wasn't dramatic or immediate, no single catastrophic moment when Catherine's carefully constructed world collapsed spectacularly around her. Instead, it was a slow, methodical, almost surgical unraveling, like watching a carefully woven tapestry being picked apart thread by painstaking thread by malicious, patient hands. Each individual small incident might have been dismissed as simple coincidence or unfortunate accident or bad timing, but together they formed an unmistakable and undeniable pattern of deliberate exclusion and calculated social assassination that grew more obvious and more devastating with each passing day. At Lady Pembroke's afternoon tea 3 days after the fateful Christmas ball, Catherine entered the elegantly appointed drawing room with her mother and immediately sensed that something fundamental had changed in the atmosphere, something she couldn't quite name but could feel like a physical presence. The room, usually warm and welcoming with the friendly chatter and comfortable buzz of women enjoying each other's company over delicate china and expensive imported tea, felt subtly but definitely different, as if the temperature had dropped several uncomfortable degrees the moment she crossed the threshold. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they faltered noticeably, slowed their natural rhythm, lost their easy, flowing quality. Meaningful glances were exchanged between women who had been her mother's friends for years, knowing looks that spoke volumes. Whispers circulated through the assembled ladies like a malicious breeze rustling through a field of flowers, carrying poison instead of pollen, spreading contamination with invisible efficiency. Lady Amelia Parker, who had been Catherine's absolute closest friend since early childhood, who had shared secrets and dreams and hundreds of lazy summer afternoons reading together in shaded gardens, who knew Catherine better than anyone, except perhaps her own mother, and certainly better than Catherine's own sister, looked up from her carefully chosen seat near the tall windows that overlooked the fashionable street below, the best seat in the room with the most natural light. For a moment that felt like an eternity stretching between them. Their eyes met directly across the crowded room full of elaborately dressed women and expensive furniture, and Catherine saw Amelia's expressive face fill with something that looked heartbreakingly like genuine anguish and sincere apology, saw real pain there, that suggested this situation was causing Amelia nearly as much suffering as it was causing Catherine herself, that she was being torn between friendship and family duty. Amelia even shifted slightly in her elegant chair, the movement subtle but unmistakable, as if preparing to rise and greet her oldest friend as she normally would have done without a second thought, as automatically as breathing. But before she could complete the movement, before she could stand or speak or even smile in greeting across the room, her mother, Lady Margaret Parker, a formidable woman in her mid-50s, whose iron-grey hair seemed to perfectly match her rigid personality and inflexible views on social propriety and proper behavior, placed a restraining hand on her daughter's arm with unmistakable and deliberate firmness, her fingers visibly tightening, and gave a nearly imperceptible but absolutely clear shake of her head. The message was crystal clear and allowed no room for interpretation or negotiation. You will not acknowledge that girl. You will not speak to her. You will not associate with her. You will act as if she doesn't exist, as if she's already dead to us socially. Amelia's face flushed deeply with visible shame, color rising from her neck to her cheeks in a wave of mortified embarrassment that made her look almost feverish. She looked down at her delicate teacup, as if it contained something absolutely fascinating that demanded her complete and undivided attention, and then, with movements that were almost violent in their abruptness, turned to engage the young lady beside her named Charlotte Pembridge, who spent most of her energy discussing ribbons and bonnets and the latest fashion plates from Paris, in animated conversation about absolutely nothing of consequence. Her laughter too bright and artificial, ringing false in the elegant room. Catherine felt the rejection like an actual physical blow, as if someone had struck her hard across the face with an open hand, the sting sharp and immediate and deeply painful. They had been friends for 15 years. 15 years. They had learned to read together, hunched over the same books in the Hamilton nursery, sounding out words and laughing at the illustrations. They had shared their first formal dancing lessons, stepping on each other's toes repeatedly and collapsing into helpless giggles until their stern dancing master had threatened to quit. They had whispered confidences late at night during country house visits, sharing their dreams and fears and the futures they imagined for themselves, futures that had seemed so bright and full of possibility. And now Amelia couldn't even meet her eyes, couldn't even offer a sympathetic smile across a crowded room, all because her mother had decided that Catherine Hamilton was no longer an acceptable associate for a young lady of good family and proper breeding. The rest of the interminable tea was absolutely excruciating, every minute stretching like hours, each second crawling past with agonizing slowness. Catherine and Eleanor found seats, not in their usual comfortable location near the window with the best natural light, where they had sat at dozens of previous gatherings over the years, their regular place that everyone knew belonged to them, but relegated to a corner near the door where less important guests were typically placed, the kind of uncomfortable seats usually reserved for distant poor relations or ambitious social climbers hoping desperately for acceptance from their betters. The other ladies present were coldly, precisely polite, greeting the Hamiltons with the bare minimum of courtesy that couldn't technically be called openly rude or constitute a direct cut that could be remarked upon publicly, but was unmistakably and deliberately unfriendly, their smiles not reaching their eyes, their words carefully chosen to convey distance and disapproval. Conversations died abruptly as Catherine and her mother approached any group, like flowers withering in frost. No one asked Catherine about her recent activities or inquired politely about her family's health as they normally would have according to basic social protocol. No one mentioned any upcoming events or suggested cordially that they should call on each other soon for a more private visit. The Hamiltons had become social ghosts, physically present but socially invisible, acknowledged only when absolutely unavoidable, and then only with the barest minimum of civility that etiquette absolutely demanded, and not one iota more. Eleanor maintained a rigidly cheerful facade throughout the ordeal, her face a mask of determined pleasantness, chatting brightly and determinedly about inconsequential matters. The unusually mild weather for December, the latest fashions arriving from Paris, the exceptional quality of Lady Pembroke's tea service and delicious cakes, and pretending not to notice the pointed snubs and calculated coldness swirling around them like invisible poison. But Catherine could see the terrible strain in her mother's overly bright smile, could see the way her hands trembled slightly, but visibly, as she lifted her delicate teacup to her lips with forced steadiness, could hear the false brittle note in her forced laughter that rang hollow and desperate. When they finally escaped and were safely enclosed in their private carriage heading home through London's crowded streets, the sounds of the city muffled by the carriage walls, Eleanor's carefully maintained facade crumbled completely, like a wall finally giving way under too much pressure, revealing the fear and anger beneath. "Das, what happened at that ball, Catherine?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a volatile combination of genuine fear and rising anger and profound confusion and maternal worry. "What did you do? What could you possibly have done to cause this complete ostracism?" Lady Margaret barely acknowledged me. She looked right through me as if I were a servant or a tradesman's wife, someone beneath her notice entirely. The Countess of Harrington looked right through us both as if we didn't exist, as if we were completely invisible, less than nothing. That's not normal social cooling or a temporary disagreement over some minor matter. That's deliberate, calculated ostracism of the worst and most damaging kind. What in God's name happened at that Christmas ball? You must tell me everything. Catherine considered lying, considered inventing some innocuous explanation that would spare her mother the worst of the truth, protect her from the ugly reality. But what would be the point of deception now? The truth would inevitably come out eventually, probably in a more damaging form twisted by gossip and speculation and malicious embellishment. Lord Lancaster made unwanted advances toward me, she said quietly, carefully, keeping her eyes fixed on her gloved hands folded precisely in her lap, unable to meet her mother's gaze. On the terrace, away from the crowd and witnesses, he was inappropriate and insistent and threatening, and I refused him, rather forcefully and publicly, I'm afraid. I may have said some things that offended him deeply. Eleanor went absolutely pale, all colour draining from her face as if someone had pulled a plug, one hand rising dramatically to her throat in a classic gesture of shock and distress and maternal horror. "Oh, Catherine. Oh, no. Oh, dear God, no." Her voice was barely above a horrified whisper, each word trembling. "Do you have any idea at all what you've done? Do you understand the magnitude of this disaster, the full implications? A man of his tremendous influence, his extensive connections throughout society and commerce, you've made a powerful and vindictive enemy of one of the most influential men in all of London's commercial and social circles. He could destroy us. He will destroy us. Should I have accepted his advances then?" Catherine asked, unable to keep the bitterness and resentment and hurt from her voice, looking up to meet her mother's eyes defiantly. Should I have smiled sweetly and thanked him profusely for the great honor of his revolting attention? Should I have been flattered and grateful that a man old enough to be my father, a man who could be my grandfather, was propositioning me to become his mistress? Is that what you would have wanted? For me to debase myself for social acceptance? No, of course not. That's not what I'm saying at all. You know that's not what I mean. But you could have been more diplomatic about it, more tactful in your refusal. Eleanor's voice rose with each word, approaching hysteria, her careful social training cracking under the pressure. You could have made excuses, claimed sudden illness, found some graceful way to extricate yourself from the situation without causing such obvious and memorable offense. You could have deflected his attention without directly insulting him in a way that would wound his pride. Now look what's happened. We're being cut. Actually cut from polite society. Do you understand what this means for your future? For your sister's future when she comes out? For your father's business that depends on social connections and goodwill? We could lose everything, Catherine. Everything we've worked for. Everything we've built. Mother, I'm sorry, truly I am. But I absolutely will not apologize for refusing a man old enough to be my father, who was suggesting something deeply inappropriate and degrading and insulting. Eleanor closed her eyes tightly and took several deep, measured breaths, visibly fighting for control of her emotions and her temper, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "What's done is done," she said finally, her voice tired and defeated and much older than her years, as if she'd aged a decade in a few minutes. We'll simply have to weather this terrible storm as best we can and hope desperately that something else captures society's notoriously fickle attention soon and they forget about us, move on to the next scandal. But the storm only intensified rather than dissipating as Eleanor had desperately hoped. At the Theatre Royal, Covent Garden 5 days after the Christmas ball, the Hamilton family occupied their usual box, not one of the absolute best boxes, which were reserved for the highest ranks of the aristocracy, but a respectable and entirely acceptable one, in the second tier on the left side of the stage, with a decent view of the performance and acceptable acoustics that didn't distort the singers' voices too badly. Catherine wore a midnight blue velvet gown that had cost a small fortune and had been made by one of London's most fashionable and expensive modistes, with her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her skilled lady's maid over an hour of painstaking work to achieve, decorated tastefully with small pearls woven through the curls that had belonged to her beloved grandmother. She wore her mother's best sapphire necklace and matching earrings, jewels that represented a significant portion of the family's movable wealth, pieces that had been in the family for 2 generations. She should have felt beautiful, confident, elegantly dressed and ready to face society with her head held high and her dignity intact, ready to show them all that she was unbowed. Instead, she felt like she was being slowly flayed alive by 1,000 small cuts, each one individually minor but collectively devastating, death by 1,000 cruel slices. During the interval between acts, as was absolutely customary and expected in polite society, they left their comfortable box to circulate through the theatre's ornate corridors with their gilt moldings and expensive artwork, accepting crystal flutes of champagne from circulating servants in livery, and theoretically exchanging pleasantries with other theatre-goers in the elaborate social dance that was as choreographed as the ballet they'd been watching. This interval circulation was when the real business of theatre-going occurred, the socializing, the strategic seeing and being seen, the intricate dance of status and connection that was as important as the actual performance on stage, perhaps even more so for many attendees who came more to be seen than to see. Catherine noticed immediately and with growing dismay how groups of people parted subtly as the Hamiltons approached, not obviously or dramatically enough to be overtly rude or to constitute a direct cut that could be remarked upon publicly or challenged, but enough to be unmistakable to anyone paying attention, enough to be deliberately hurtful. A cluster of young ladies near the champagne table saw them coming from a distance and suddenly discovered an urgent need to move to the other side of the corridor, their movements hasty and their whispers audible, their fans fluttering rapidly as they exchanged meaningful glances. An older couple she had known for years, family friends who had dined at the Hamilton house multiple times and whose hospitality the Hamiltons had enjoyed, suddenly became deeply and thoroughly fascinated by a rather mediocre painting on the wall depicting some forgettable historical scene, turning their backs entirely rather than acknowledge the Hamiltons' presence and be forced into uncomfortable conversation that might taint them by association. Most painful and personally wounding was when the Earl of Westfield, a young widower of perhaps 30, who had danced with her twice at previous balls over the past season and shown what seemed like genuine interest in getting to know her better, perhaps even with matrimonial intentions given the way he'd sought her out repeatedly, saw her approaching down the corridor and deliberately, unmistakably turned away with a movement so sharp it was almost violent. She had seen the moment of recognition in his eyes, the flash of awareness that she was there, the brief flicker of what might have been sympathy or regret, before he consciously averted his gaze and pretended to be deeply absorbed in conversation with another gentleman, his back turned to her in the most cutting gesture possible, acting as if she simply didn't exist, as if their previous pleasant interactions had never happened. Eleanor's grip on Catherine's arm tightened painfully until it hurt quite badly, her fingernails nearly piercing through the expensive fabric of Catherine's elegant sleeve and the thin glove beneath, certainly leaving marks. "Keep your head high," she hissed through a smile that looked more like a grimace of pain, her lips barely moving. "Smile as if nothing is wrong. Don't let them see that it bothers you at all. Don't give them the satisfaction of knowing they've wounded you. That's what they want, to see you broken. Don't give it to them." But how could it not bother her? How was she supposed to pretend that watching her entire social world crumble systematically around her, piece by piece, wasn't absolutely devastating? She wasn't just being snubbed at a few parties, she was being systematically erased from society, as if she had never existed, as if the Hamiltons had never been accepted at all, as if their wealth and her father's success and their years of careful cultivation of connections meant absolutely nothing without the approval and acceptance of the old aristocracy and those like Lancaster who held real power. In Thomas Hamilton's private study 1 week after the Christmas ball, he sat behind his substantial mahogany desk as the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows behind him, illuminating the papers scattered across the leather desk surface and the lines of worry that had noticeably deepened around his eyes and mouth in recent days, carving grooves that made him look years older than he had just a fortnight ago. Normally this was his favorite, most peaceful time of day, the quiet hour before dinner when he could review paperwork in comfortable solitude, make plans for future investments, feel deep satisfaction with everything he had built from almost nothing through decades of hard work and sacrifice and shrewd decisions. Now the familiar room felt oppressive rather than comfortable, the walls seeming to close in, and the paperwork in front of him felt like an indictment of his failures rather than a record of his successes, each document a reminder of what was slipping away. His longtime business partner, Richard Whitmore, a man he had known and trusted implicitly for 15 years, a man he had considered a genuine friend as well as a valuable colleague, a man whose children had played with his own daughters, occupied the chair across from him looking deeply uncomfortable. Richard was turning his expensive beaver-skin hat nervously between his hands, in a repetitive gesture that betrayed his extreme discomfort with this conversation, completely unable to meet Thomas's steady, searching gaze directly, his eyes fixed on the carpet or the window, or anywhere except his old friend's face. "You must try to understand my position, Thomas," Richard was saying, his voice pleading desperately for understanding and forgiveness, each word carefully chosen. "It's not personal. God knows it's not personal. You know I respect you tremendously, have always valued your insight and judgment and counsel. I have always valued our partnership highly, considered you a genuine friend as well as a colleague, one of the few men in London I could truly trust. But Lancaster, he supplies the textiles for half our manufacturing clients, controls the fabric market in ways that are nearly absolute. If he were to cut our supply entirely, or dramatically increase prices specifically for us to price us out of the market, or deliberately delay our shipments to make us miss crucial delivery deadlines and breach our contracts, it would be absolutely catastrophic for the business, potentially ruinous." Richard finally looked up, and Thomas could see genuine distress and conflict in his old friend's eyes, could see that this decision was costing him something emotionally, even as he made it, that he wasn't entirely comfortable with his own choice. "I have shareholders to answer to, investors who expect returns on their capital and won't accept excuses. I have employees, dozens of them, good men with families who depend on me for their livelihoods, who have wives and children to feed and house. I can't risk everything, can't risk all of that and all those people because of a social disagreement between your daughter and Lancaster that honestly has nothing whatsoever to do with business or commerce. That should be completely separate from our professional relationship. So that's it." Thomas's voice was carefully controlled, but Richard could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface, could hear the sense of betrayal that his old friend was trying so hard to contain. 15 years of successful partnership, of friendship, of building profitable businesses together and supporting each other through difficulties, all of that means nothing, counts for nothing, compared to Edmund Lancaster's wounded pride over being rejected by a young woman. "I'm not saying it means nothing at all," Richard protested weakly, his voice lacking conviction even to his own ears. "I'm just saying, we need to suspend our joint ventures temporarily, just for now, just until this unfortunate situation somehow resolves itself, until things calm down, until Lancaster's anger cools and he becomes reasonable again, willing to separate business from personal matters." "And if it doesn't resolve?" Thomas asked quietly, already knowing the answer, already seeing the future stretching before him. "If his anger doesn't cool, if he never becomes reasonable, what then, Richard? What happens to our 15 years of partnership then?" Richard said nothing in response, just continued turning his expensive hat between his hands nervously, looking absolutely miserable but also clearly resolute, his jaw set. He had made his choice, had chosen his own business interests and his employees, welfare over friendship and loyalty, and no amount of arguing or pleading or appeals to their shared history was going to change his mind now. The decision had already been made before he arrived here, probably made days ago after careful consideration and agonizing, and this conversation was merely the painful formality of ending what had once been a valued relationship. After Richard left, closing the study door quietly behind him with a soft click that sounded like a death knell, Thomas sat alone in the gathering darkness for a very long time, not even bothering to light the lamps, as the winter sun set early and shadows filled the room, staring at the papers spread across his desk without really seeing them at all, the numbers and letters blurring together meaninglessly. He had built his considerable fortune through 30 years of relentless hard work, careful planning and analysis, strategic relationship building, and an almost preternatural ability to read market trends. He had successfully transformed himself from the son of a moderately successful merchant, respectable enough but decidedly middle class with limited prospects, into one of London's most respected private bankers, a man whose financial advice was actively sought by members of the aristocracy who would never have acknowledged his father's existence. He had marriages to arrange for his daughters, Catherine and her younger sister Charlotte, who was still safely in the schoolroom, innocent and unaware, and a legacy to protect and pass on to future generations. He had worked so hard, sacrificed so much of his youth and health and time with his family, to build something substantial and lasting, and now he could feel it all slipping inexorably through his fingers, like water or sand, impossible to hold or contain, because his beloved daughter had dared to refuse the unwanted advances of a powerful and vindictive man who couldn't tolerate being told no. Richard Whitmore wasn't the only one abandoning the Hamilton business interests like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Two other long-standing partners had diplomatically paused their joint investments pending review of current circumstances, which everyone understood to mean pending Lancaster's approval, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. A substantial loan that had been practically approved already, that Thomas had been counting on to fund a particularly promising new venture in manufacturing that could have doubled their wealth, suddenly encountered mysterious, technical complications that required additional review by committees that somehow never quite got around to actually scheduling the necessary meetings, the delays stretching indefinitely. An excellent opportunity to supply fine wine to the household of the Duke of Wellington himself, a contract that would have been both highly profitable and tremendously prestigious, potentially opening doors to other aristocratic households and establishing the Hamiltons as purveyors to the very best families, evaporated overnight without any explanation whatsoever, the promised contract simply vanishing. Thomas noticed through his carefully cultivated network of contacts and informants that Lancaster's wine merchant received the lucrative contract instead, a fact that couldn't possibly be coincidental. Edmund Lancaster wasn't making direct, provable threats. He was far too intelligent and too calculating for anything so crude and obvious that could be challenged or taken to law. He didn't need to explicitly say, "Stop doing business with Hamilton or I'll ruin you." He simply whispered careful suggestions in the right ears, expressed seemingly innocent concerns about the Hamiltons' judgment and character and stability, wondered aloud whether they were really the sort of people one wanted to be closely associated with in business or society. He dropped casual comments about Thomas's banking practices in conversations with other merchants. Nothing actionable or specific enough that he could be sued for slander, just enough to plant seeds of doubt and concern and make people nervous. He delayed shipments to companies that did business with the Hamiltons, making them miss important deadlines and frustrating their customers, who then blamed the Hamiltons for the failures, then sympathetically suggested that perhaps the Hamiltons' business connections were becoming unreliable and one should consider alternative partnerships. He casually mentioned to key people in social settings that he'd heard rumors, completely unverified of course. He would absolutely hate to spread unsubstantiated gossip, but felt people should be aware that the Hamilton Bank might be experiencing some financial difficulties and that their depositors should perhaps consider moving their funds to more stable institutions as a precautionary measure. None of it was obvious enough to prove deliberate malice or constitute actionable slander that could be challenged in court. Each individual incident could be plausibly explained away as simple coincidence, normal miscommunication that happens in business, or just the usual volatility of business dealings in uncertain economic times. But together, taken as a whole and examined with clear eyes, they formed an unmistakable pattern of systematic, methodical destruction that was devastatingly effective precisely because it was so subtle and difficult to directly prove or combat, death by 1,000 invisible cuts. And Thomas Hamilton, who had spent his entire adult life painstakingly building his fortune brick by careful brick, establishing his reputation through decades of honest dealing, could only watch helplessly as Edmund Lancaster dismantled it all with the same methodical, deliberate precision, pulling out supporting stones one by one with patient malice until the entire structure threatened to collapse into rubble. The night at the opera should have been a welcome relief, a respite from the nightmare that Catherine's life had become in the space of a single week. She genuinely loved music, with a passion she usually reserved for books and intellectual pursuits, finding in it an emotional release she couldn't find elsewhere. She found profound beauty in the mathematical precision of musical composition, in the way melody and harmony wove together to create something transcendent that was greater than the sum of their individual parts, something that spoke to the soul in ways words never could. Opera especially moved her deeply. The drama, the raw emotion, the sheer human passion of it all expressed through voices of extraordinary power and beauty, the combination of music and theatre and spectacle that could transport her entirely out of herself and her troubles. But even surrounded by Mozart's sublime and incomparable beauty, at the prestigious Theatre Royal in Covent Garden, one of London's most celebrated and expensive venues, sitting in their respectable box, watching extraordinarily talented performers pour their hearts into the music, she felt the oppressive weight of hostile stares, like physical pressure against her skin, like being slowly crushed by invisible hands. Her midnight blue silk gown, one of the most beautiful and expensive she owned, purchased just last season at considerable cost from a fashionable French modiste who dressed half the aristocracy, seemed to have lost all its luster and elegance. The fabric that had once made her feel like a princess now feeling like a costume, a disguise that fooled no one. Or perhaps it was she who had lost something essential, some invisible quality of confidence and belonging that she had once worn as unconsciously as the dress itself, as natural as breathing. The confidence and sense of rightful place that she had always carried like invisible armor, the certainty of her position in the world, no matter how much she privately questioned its values and hypocrisies, was irreparably cracked and broken like shattered glass. And everyone could see the fractures, could sense her vulnerability like sharks scenting blood in the water from miles away, circling closer with each pass. The opera being performed was Don Giovanni, Mozart's masterpiece about a libertine nobleman whose accumulated sins and offenses against women in society eventually damn him to hell. Catherine found uncomfortable and unwelcome parallels in the story. Powerful men who felt entitled to take whatever they wanted without consequences, women who were powerless to effectively stop them or seek justice, a society that looked the other way and made excuses as long as the men were wealthy, entitled, and useful to those in power. She watched with grim satisfaction as the Commendatore's ghost dragged Don Giovanni screaming into hellfire at the opera's conclusion, and wished fervently that such swift divine justice actually existed in the real world rather than just in operas and morality tales, that men like Lancaster faced real consequences for their actions rather than being rewarded with more power. During the interval, while other patrons circulated through the ornately decorated gallery, drinking champagne from crystal flutes and exchanging animated gossip about the performance and each other and the latest scandals, Catherine fled like a hunted animal seeking cover. She absolutely couldn't bear another round of pointed snubs and deliberately audible whispered comments. Couldn't endure watching people she had known for years pretend she didn't exist or turn away when she approached as if she carried some contagious disease. She escaped to a quieter side corridor, much less frequented by the main crush of fashionable society, lined with formal portraits of famous actors and singers from decades past, their painted faces watching silently from ornate frames, witnesses to countless human dramas. She stopped before a particularly fine portrait of Sarah Siddons, the legendary tragic actress whose powerful performances had defined an entire era of English theatre, whose very name was synonymous with dramatic excellence. The portrait showed her in elaborate costume, probably as Lady Macbeth, looking imperious and dramatic and powerful and utterly in control of her fate, a woman who commanded rather than submitted. Catherine stared at that painted face and thought bitterly of the painful irony. Her own life had become a tragedy entirely worthy of the stage, the innocent young woman systematically destroyed by the vindictive machinations of a spurned suitor. brought low through no fault of her own except daring to refuse unwanted advances and expecting to be treated as a person with rights and dignity rather than property to be acquired. Hiding isn't your usual style, Miss Hamilton. Catherine's heart leaped violently into her throat as she spun around with a startled gasp, one hand rising instinctively to her chest, where she could feel her heart hammering. Alexander Thornbury stood several meters away, leaning casually against a marble column in a pose that managed to look both relaxed and somehow elegant, as if he'd been carefully positioned by a portrait painter. He wore an impeccable black tailcoat that emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist, a grey silk waistcoat embroidered with subtle silver thread that caught the light whenever he moved, and a white cravat tied with mathematical precision. His black hair had that same artful disarray she remembered from the Christmas ball, and his storm-grey eyes were watching her with what seemed like genuine concern, rather than amusement or mockery, or the casual cruelty she'd come to expect from society. "I'm not hiding," Catherine lied automatically, defensively, turning back to the portrait to avoid looking at him directly, afraid of what he might see in her face if she met his eyes. "I'm appreciating art. This is a particularly fine portrait. Siddons was magnificent in her time, unmatched." "Of course you are." There was gentle humor in his voice, but not mockery or condescension, no cruelty beneath the words. He moved closer, also pretending to study the portrait with apparent interest, standing near enough that she could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive, cedar and bergamot. "And I'm here purely by chance, pure coincidence. Not because I saw you escape from the main gallery as though fleeing from pursuing demons or creditors. The coincidence is quite remarkable, really. What are the odds? Despite everything, her misery, her anger, her determination to dislike him and everything he represented, Catherine felt her lips twitch involuntarily toward a smile, despite her best efforts to maintain a cold, aloof expression. Our demons would actually be considerably preferable to the Countess of Harrington and her vicious circle of friends, she said quietly, still not looking at him. At least demons are refreshingly honest about their malicious intentions and don't pretend otherwise. They don't pretend to be your friend while simultaneously whispering poison about you behind your back and destroying your reputation with smiles on their faces. Alexander laughed softly, not the performative laughter of the ballroom meant to be heard and admired by others, but something that sounded genuine and unguarded, almost surprised. "Touché. The Countess is indeed absolutely formidable and utterly ruthless. I believe she actually keeps a detailed written list of social transgressions, carefully organized by severity and date, cross-referenced and annotated, with proposed punishments meticulously noted for each category of offense. I've seen it. She showed it to me once as a warning." He turned to look at her directly now, and the amusement in his eyes gave way to something more serious and concerned, his expression shifting. "I've seen what Lancaster is doing. To you personally, to your family's business interests and social standing, the whisper campaign, the systematic business pressure on your father, the social ostracism. It's exactly what I warned you he would do, exactly what I feared." Catherine felt her entire body go completely rigid, defensive walls slamming into place with almost audible force, every muscle tensing. The last thing she needed or wanted was pity from the Duke of Thornbury, of all people, the last person whose sympathy she could bear. "I don't need your pity, Your Grace," she said coldly, still deliberately not looking at him, fixing her gaze on Siddons' painted face. "Whatever you think you've seen, whatever you think you know about my situation, I assure you I have it completely under control. My family and I will weather this temporary difficulty." "Good," he said, and his tone was firm and sincere, without any trace of condescension or false sympathy or aristocratic superiority, "because I'm not offering pity. Pity is useless and frankly insulting to someone like you. What I'm offering is something else entirely. A solution, if you're willing to hear it." She turned to stare at him directly now, deeply suspicious of his motives and searching for the trap or angle or game he must surely be playing, looking for the cruel joke. "What kind of solution could you possibly offer for this situation?" she asked skeptically, her voice sharp with defensive sarcasm. "Unless you can somehow rewrite the past week and make Lancaster forget what happened, erase it from existence and everyone's memory, I don't see how you or anyone else can help. The damage is done." Alexander hesitated visibly, the first time she'd seen him appear genuinely uncertain about anything, a crack in his confident facade. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, messing it up even further, and something about that nervous, very human gesture made her rigid defenses lower slightly despite her best efforts to maintain them, made him seem less like an untouchable aristocrat and more like an actual person, one that will sound completely absurd when I first explain it, he admitted honestly, meeting her eyes directly, possibly even insulting or offensive. But I swear to you on my family's honor, on everything I hold dear, that my intentions are genuine and that this could actually work, if you'll trust me. But you need to hear me out completely before you make any judgment. Can you do that? Can you listen without interrupting or dismissing it out of hand? Catherine crossed her arms defensively across her chest, her posture rigid, but her curiosity definitely piqued despite her best efforts to remain aloof and uninterested, despite telling herself this was probably some cruel joke at her expense. I'm listening, but this had better be good, Your Grace. I'm not in the mood for games or amusement at my expense. Alexander took a deep breath as if steadying himself. Lancaster is systematically destroying your reputation and your family's social standing because you rejected him publicly and humiliated him in front of me, he began, choosing each word with obvious care and precision. He's deliberately painting you as difficult, proud, morally questionable, fundamentally unsuitable for respectable society. He's spreading carefully crafted rumors about everything from your character to your family's business practices to your suitability as a potential wife. None of it is remotely true, but truth doesn't particularly matter in these situations when the person spreading the lies has enough power and influence and credibility. And society is believing him entirely because he has tremendous influence and wealth, and has positioned himself as a pillar of respectability, while you have no one with comparable social weight defending your version of events. No one willing to stand up publicly and say, I know Catherine Hamilton personally and intimately, and she's nothing at all like what Lancaster describes. I'm painfully aware of all this, Catherine said impatiently, frustrated by his recitation of facts she lived with every waking moment. I'm living it. What's your point? My point, Alexander continued, his grey eyes never leaving her face when watching her carefully, is that if someone with substantially more social influence than Lancaster were to demonstrate clear, unmistakable, very public interest in you, to court you openly and obviously with apparent serious matrimonial intentions, it would completely change the narrative that Lancaster is so carefully trying to create and has been spreading so effectively. He paused deliberately, letting her absorb this, watching her face carefully for her reaction. Society would immediately begin to question everything they've heard from Lancaster. They'd think, if the Duke of Thornbury himself is courting Miss Hamilton seriously, pursuing her with clear, honourable intentions toward marriage, seeking her father's permission, then she absolutely cannot be as unsuitable or morally compromised as Lancaster suggests. The Duke is far too discerning, far too conscious of his elevated position and ancient title, to court someone genuinely problematic or damaged. He could have any woman in England. Why would he choose her, unless Lancaster's accusations are false? Perhaps Lancaster is the one who's lying. Perhaps he's motivated by spite rather than concern for society. Perhaps Catherine Hamilton rejected him because he was behaving inappropriately, not because there's something wrong with her character. Catherine's eyes widened progressively as she began to understand the full import of what he was suggesting, the implications becoming clear. The full weight of his proposal hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. You're suggesting, she said very slowly, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing, each word carefully enunciated, that you would court me, actually court me publicly, where everyone can see, to directly contradict Lancaster's narrative and restore my reputation. Yes, exactly that. But why? The question burst from her with more force and emotion than she had intended, raw and unguarded. Why would you do this? What could you possibly gain from becoming entangled in my social disaster? You're one of the most eligible bachelors in all of England, probably in all of Europe. You could have literally any woman you wanted with a snap of your fingers. Why would you deliberately attach yourself to someone whose reputation is being systematically destroyed as we speak? Why risk damaging your own standing by association with what society currently considers social poison? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him wrestling internally with how to answer, how much truth to reveal, how vulnerable to make himself before this young woman who had already rejected him once. Several reasons, he said finally, his voice serious and measured. And first and most importantly, what Lancaster is doing to you is fundamentally unconscionable. It's cruel and unjust and represents everything wrong with the power structures of our society, and I have the power to stop it, or at least significantly mitigate the damage. When you have power and the ability to help someone who's being wronged, I believe you have a moral obligation to use that power, not just sit back comfortably and watch injustice unfold because it doesn't directly affect you or your interests." He paused, then continued more quietly, his voice dropping. "Second, Lancaster has gotten away with this kind of vindictive behavior too many times over the years. He ruins people who displease him or fail to show him sufficient deference, and he faces absolutely no consequences because everyone is too afraid of him to push back or challenge him publicly. Someone needs to demonstrate that he's not invincible, that he can't simply destroy anyone who refuses to defer to him or submit to his demands. I have enough power and social insulation that I can push back hard without fearing the same kind of systematic destruction he's currently inflicting on your family. He can't touch me." "And third," Catherine prompted, sensing there was more, something more personal that he was reluctant to share. "Third," Alexander said, and now there was something almost vulnerable in his expression, a softness she hadn't seen before. "You intrigue me profoundly. You have ever since the moment you called me an arrogant peacock to my face without a hint of fear or deference. You're the first person I can remember in years, perhaps ever, who has seen past the title and the wealth and the performance to the actual person underneath and told me honestly what you thought, without any filter or calculation. No flattery, no calculation, no angling for advantage or favor. Just honest opinion, even when it was decidedly unflattering to me and my character. Do you have any idea at all how rare that is in our circles? How valuable, how refreshing to meet someone who sees you as a person, rather than a title and a fortune?" Catherine studied him skeptically and intensely, looking hard for signs of deception or manipulation or hidden agenda, waiting for the cruel punchline. "So this is what? Entertainment for you? An interesting diversion from boredom? A chance to play the hero and feel noble?" "No," he said firmly, meeting her eyes directly without wavering. "Or at least, it's not primarily that. Look, I'll be completely honest with you about everything because you deserve honesty. Will I enjoy demonstrating that Lancaster isn't as powerful as he thinks he is? That someone can successfully defy him? Yes, absolutely. Will there be some personal satisfaction in outmaneuvering a man I consider a bully and a predator who uses his wealth and influence to hurt vulnerable people? Without question. But those are secondary motivations at best. The primary motivation is that you don't deserve what's happening to you. I have the means to stop it or at least help significantly, and doing nothing when I could help would make me complicit in injustice. And I've seen too much injustice in my life to stand by and watch more unfold when I have the power to intervene. This would be entirely a pretense, though," Catherine said slowly, thinking through all the implications carefully, looking for the flaws in the plan. "A performance for society. We'd be deliberately lying to everyone." "Not lying exactly," Alexander corrected gently, his tone careful. "Just perhaps expediting a courtship that might have occurred naturally under different circumstances, with perhaps a bit more theatrical flourish than might otherwise happen. But the core of it, me publicly demonstrating genuine interest and respect for you, that doesn't have to be false at all. In fact, it won't be false. I do find you genuinely interesting and admirable." Catherine's mind was racing, examining the proposition from every possible angle, looking systematically for flaws and problems and potential disasters. "If I agree to this," she said very carefully, weighing each word, "I would need rules, clear boundaries, explicit agreements about exactly what this arrangement entails and what it absolutely doesn't include." A small smile curved Alexander's lips, as if her response was exactly what he'd expected and even hoped for. "I would expect nothing less from you. You're far too intelligent to agree to something without terms clearly established beforehand." "What would you require?" Catherine raised one finger deliberately, ticking off her conditions with the precision of a lawyer negotiating a contract. "First and most important, this is strictly an arrangement of mutual convenience and benefit. There are absolutely no romantic expectations or obligations on either side. We are actors performing for an audience, nothing more. Neither of us is required to develop genuine feelings for the other, and neither of us should reasonably expect such feelings to develop. This is business, essentially. When the performance has achieved its goal, when my reputation is restored and Lancaster has backed off, We end it by mutual agreement, cleanly, amicably, without drama or recrimination or bitterness. Understood and agreed, Alexander said without hesitation. Second, Catherine continued, raising another finger. While we are engaged in this arrangement, you cannot court or be seen in compromising situations with other women. That would completely undermine the entire purpose if it appeared you were pursuing me while simultaneously conducting affairs or flirtations elsewhere. Society would immediately conclude that your interest in me isn't genuine, which defeats the entire point of the exercise. Can you maintain that fiction of exclusivity? Alexander made an exaggerated grimace of mock pain, pressing a hand to his heart dramatically. You're asking me to be monogamous in a fake relationship. The irony is absolutely delicious and rather painful to my vanity and reputation. But yes, I agree without reservation. I'll be a model of complete fidelity. However artificial that fidelity might technically be, I'll be the most devoted suitor London has ever seen. Third, Catherine said, her voice growing more serious, her expression more vulnerable. My family absolutely cannot know this is an arrangement, especially my mother. She would never countenance such deliberate deception under any circumstances, and if she knew the truth, it would show clearly in her behavior and facial expressions and completely invalidate the entire performance. Everyone must believe this is genuine courtship, with real feelings involved, including my parents. Can you live with that level of deception toward people who will welcome you warmly into their home and trust you completely with their daughter's happiness and future? Alexander's expression became noticeably more somber, and he took a moment before answering, clearly thinking through the ethical implications. That troubles me more than I expected it would, he admitted honestly, his discomfort evident. I genuinely like your parents from what I've observed. Your father is a fundamentally good man trying his best to protect his family under difficult circumstances, and your mother clearly loves you deeply despite her social ambitions. Deceiving them feels morally wrong, feels like a betrayal of their trust. But I also recognize that for this to work, for this to convincingly counter Lancaster's narrative, it absolutely has to appear completely genuine to everyone without exception. So yes, I can live with it, though I won't particularly enjoy that specific aspect of the deception. And fourth, Catherine said, and now her voice dropped, becoming more vulnerable and uncertain than she intended, revealing the fear beneath her careful control. When this arrangement ends, when we mutually agree that it has served its purpose and should conclude, you must promise to end it respectfully. No public humiliation. No stories spread about how I was unsuitable or boring or that you simply grew tired of me. I need your absolute word that you won't make me into a cautionary tale or an object of pity, that you'll protect my reputation even as we part ways. Something in the vulnerability of her voice, the genuine fear barely hidden beneath her words, made Alexander's expression soften completely. He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the subtle variations of grey in his eyes, the sincerity in his expression. Catherine, Miss Hamilton, when this arrangement ends, if that's truly what we both want, you'll be the one who ends it. You can dismiss me publicly. You can declare that I'm too superficial for your intellectual standards, that you found me tedious and shallow, that we simply weren't truly suited despite our best efforts. I'll accept full responsibility for the ending in whatever form you prefer, and I'll do it in a way that enhances rather than damages your reputation, that makes you look discerning rather than rejected. I give you my word on that, and I don't give my word lightly. Catherine studied him intensely for a long moment, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda in those storm-grey eyes. But all she saw was apparent sincerity, and perhaps something else. Genuine respect and an unexpected vulnerability that suggested this conversation was costing him something too, that he was taking a real risk here by exposing himself to potential rejection again. Why do I get the distinct feeling you've thought about this extensively? She asked perceptively, tilting her head. This isn't a spur-of-the-moment suggestion that just occurred to you, is it? You've been planning this for some time. Alexander had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, a faint flush coloring his cheeks. I may have been considering various possibilities since the night of the ball, he admitted, running a hand through his hair again. After I saw what happened between you and Lancaster, after I watched the way people started treating you and your family with such calculated cruelty over the following days, after I heard some of the vicious things Lancaster was spreading through his network of influence, I've been thinking about whether there was anything I could realistically do to help, and this seemed like the most effective option available. I've essentially been trying to gather the courage to propose it to you, knowing you might reject the idea, or worse, laugh in my face." "Courage?" Catherine raised an eyebrow skeptically. The great Duke of Thornbury, afraid of a simple conversation with a merchant's daughter. "Terrified, actually," he said with surprising honesty and a self-deprecating smile. "You're rather intimidating when you're angry, as I learned quite memorably on that terrace. I was genuinely concerned you might throw something at my head or cause a scene that would make Lancaster's reaction look mild. You have quite a temper when provoked." Despite everything, the stress, the fear, the uncertainty of what she was seriously considering, Catherine felt a genuine smile tug at her lips for the first time in days. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of intense internal debate, weighing all the potential consequences and benefits, she took a deep breath and extended her hand in that same curiously masculine gesture she'd used before, formal, businesslike, as if they were negotiating a straightforward commercial transaction rather than an elaborate social deception with potentially devastating consequences if discovered. "Then we have an agreement, Your Grace. A temporary arrangement of mutual benefit to counter Lancaster's systematic campaign and restore my family's standing, with clear terms and boundaries that we've both agreed to, until such time as we mutually agree it has served its purpose and should end." Alexander looked at the extended hand for a long moment, and Catherine could see him considering carefully how to respond. Then, slowly and deliberately, he took her hand, but instead of shaking it as she had expected, he turned it gently, carefully, and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was both respectful and somehow more intimate than a simple handshake would have been. The kiss was appropriate, gentlemanly, perfectly within the bounds of proper behavior, but he let his lips linger for just a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary, and he kept his eyes locked on hers the entire time, creating a moment of connection that made something unexpected flutter in Catherine's chest. "What was that?" she asked when he finally released her hand, her voice emerging slightly more breathless than she had intended, her heart beating faster than it should. "The practice," Alexander said, his expression innocent but his eyes gleaming with unmistakable mischief. "If we're going to convince all of London society that I'm courting you with serious matrimonial intentions, I need to be completely convincing from the very start. Men who are genuinely courting don't shake hands like business partners closing a deal. They find excuses for innocent but meaningful physical contact, hand kisses, assisting with mounting horses, helping with coats and wraps. These small gestures communicate romantic interest while remaining entirely proper and acceptable. I'm simply beginning as I mean to continue." "You're absolutely incorrigible," Catherine said, but she couldn't entirely suppress the slight smile that tugged at her lips, despite her best efforts to maintain a stern expression. "Guilty as charged," he agreed cheerfully, "but I'm also very good at what I do. Trust me, by the time we're finished with this performance, no one in all of London will doubt for a moment that the Duke of Thornbury is utterly smitten with Miss Catherine Hamilton." From somewhere down the corridor, they heard the sound of a bell being rung, the 5-minute warning that the opera was about to resume. "I should return to my parents' box," Catherine said, nervously smoothing her skirts and adjusting her shawl. "Mother will be beside herself with worry if I'm not there when the curtain rises for the second act." "Of course." Alexander stepped back immediately, giving her room to move past him. But as she began to walk away, he spoke again. "Miss Hamilton," she paused, turning back to face him. "Yes? Tomorrow afternoon, Hyde Park, Rotten Row, 4 o'clock. As many respectable families as possible will be out riding during the fashionable hour, seeing and being seen. It would be an excellent, perhaps ideal opportunity for our first public appearance together. If you and your father could arrange to be riding there at that time, I could arrange to encounter you. Purely by coincidence, of course. We'd exchange pleasantries. I'd request permission to join you, and we'd ride together where everyone can see." The gossip would start immediately and spread like wildfire. Catherine hesitated, her heart suddenly pounding hard. This was the true point of no return. Once she agreed to this meeting, once they began their public performance, there would be no taking it back without serious consequences. She would be committed to this course of action with all its attendant risks and uncertain outcomes. But the alternative was to continue watching helplessly as her family's world crumbled around them, continue being slowly crushed under Lancaster's vindictive and systematic campaign, continue helpless while her father's business was methodically destroyed and her own prospects were systematically eliminated. "I'll be there," she said finally, the words feeling momentous despite their simplicity, "with my father. He goes riding most afternoons when the weather permits. It won't be difficult at all to ensure we're in Hyde Park at exactly 4 o'clock. Alexander's smile was different this time, not the practiced, performative smile he showed to society at large, but something more genuine, pleased, almost relieved. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Hamilton. I promise you with complete sincerity, we're going to make this work." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak further without her voice betraying her emotions, and turned toward the gallery where she knew her parents would be waiting with increasing anxiety about her prolonged absence. As she walked away, forcing her steps to remain measured and calm when she wanted to either run or collapse from the emotional strain, she tried desperately to process what she had just agreed to. A fake courtship with the Duke of Thornbury. An elaborate performance specifically designed to fool absolutely everyone, including her own parents. A calculated gambit to outmaneuver one of London's most powerful and vindictive men. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The small voice of reason and caution in her head whispered insistently, absolutely everything. You could develop real feelings for a man who's only pretending. You could be publicly humiliated when the truth inevitably comes out. You could destroy your reputation even more thoroughly than Lancaster has. This could go catastrophically wrong in 100 different ways you haven't even imagined yet. But she had made her choice, and Catherine Hamilton, for all her faults and fears and uncertainties, was not someone who made a decision and then second-guessed herself into paralysis. Tomorrow afternoon in Hyde Park, her new life would begin. For better or worse, she had just agreed to become the pretend beloved of London's most notorious bachelor. And despite her best efforts to remain analytical and detached, despite her firm determination to treat this as purely a practical arrangement, nothing more, she couldn't entirely suppress the small flutter of anticipation in her chest at the thought of seeing Alexander Thornbury again. She firmly told that flutter to shut up and mind its own business. This was a practical arrangement, nothing more and nothing less. She was not, absolutely not under any circumstances, going to be one of those foolish women who fell for a charming duke's practiced performance. She was smarter than that. She had to be, because if she wasn't, if she allowed herself to develop real feelings in what was supposed to be a fake courtship, this arrangement was going to hurt far more deeply than Lancaster's vindictive campaign ever could. Hyde Park was London's magnificent green heart, a vast expanse of carefully manicured grounds, serpentine waterways, and meticulously maintained riding paths where the aristocracy came religiously to see and be seen, especially during the fashionable afternoon hours, when the quality emerged to display themselves and their finest horses and carriages. The December air was crisp and cold, but refreshingly clear, the weak winter sun shining through scattered clouds, and Catherine sat side-saddle on her favourite mare, a spirited chestnut named Athena with a temperament as stubborn as her owner's, wearing a forest green riding habit that had been specially designed for riding side-saddle. Her father rode companionably beside her on his impressive black stallion, and she could see the tension that had been gripping him for days beginning to ease slightly in the fresh air and open space. They rounded a gentle curve in the winding path, and then she saw him. Alexander was mounted on a magnificent dapple-grey Arabian stallion, and when he spotted them, his face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. He guided his horse toward them with practiced ease, stopping at a respectful distance before greeting Thomas first with perfect protocol. "Mr. Hamilton, what an unexpected pleasure to encounter you here, and Miss Hamilton, you look radiant. Green is definitely your colour." Thomas looked surprised but pleased. "Your Grace, this is indeed an honour. I wasn't aware you were acquainted with my daughter. We were introduced at Lancaster's Christmas ball," Alexander said smoothly, the lie rolling off his tongue. "Though introduced might be generous. We rather encountered each other under memorable circumstances." Catherine felt her cheeks warm at the memory, but Alexander was already turning back to Thomas. "Mr. Hamilton, or if I may, I would like to request permission to accompany you on your ride, unless you prefer private time with your daughter, which I would certainly understand." Thomas hesitated only briefly before agreeing, and Catherine could see hope beginning to bloom in his eyes. And so the performance began. They rode together along Rotten Row, and Catherine was acutely aware of every glance that followed them. Carriages slowed. Groups of ladies whispered behind fans. Gentlemen exchanged significant looks. The gossip machine had just received fresh fuel. Alexander made pleasant conversation with Thomas about wines and banking, but each time Thomas looked ahead, Alexander took the opportunity to glance at Catherine, glances just long enough to be noticed by observers, but not so obvious as to be inappropriate. It was masterful. After they'd ridden for 15 minutes, Alexander said loud enough to be overheard, "Miss Hamilton, your father mentioned you're an avid reader. May I ask what kind of literature you prefer?" "Philosophy, mostly," Catherine answered honestly. "Rousseau, Voltaire, some English texts, Mary Wollstonecraft when I can find her." Alexander's surprise seemed genuine. "Wollstonecraft, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. You know it? I've read it, several years ago. My younger sister, who is terribly progressive, left a copy in my library. I found it thought-provoking." They continued riding, the conversation flowing naturally, and Catherine found herself genuinely enjoying his company, despite her determination to remain detached. He was intelligent, well-read, and when he dropped his performative charm, surprisingly sincere. At that precise moment, they passed Edmund Lancaster in an elegant carriage. When he saw Alexander riding beside Catherine, his face darkened visibly. Alexander noticed and turned to Catherine. "Miss Hamilton, that path leads to a particularly lovely lake. If your father permits, I'd like to show it to you." It was a bold request, and Thomas hesitated only a moment before nodding. Once they were slightly separated from Thomas, Alexander slowed his horse. "That was Lancaster. Did you see his expression?" "Hard to miss," Catherine murmured. "Perfect. By tomorrow, half of London will know I'm courting you." They reached the lake, and Alexander dismounted, then helped Catherine down. His hands were firm at her waist, and for a moment they stood very close. "Thank you," she said, stepping back quickly. They walked to the lake's edge in companionable silence. Finally, Alexander spoke. "May I ask why you despise the social season so profoundly?" Catherine considered not answering, but something made her honest. "Because it's all false, everyone pretending, and women are merely commodities, evaluated by beauty and virtue, as if we lack minds of our own." Alexander was quiet. "You're right, about all of it." He paused. "You know what I think you should do? After this situation resolves? Travel. See Rome, Athens, Paris. Study. Write. Live. Unmarried women can't simply travel alone. Then don't travel alone. Or marry someone who doesn't object to you having your own mind. Men like that don't exist. Perhaps you simply haven't encountered the right ones yet." There was something in how he said it that made her heart skip. "We should return," she said abruptly. As they rode back, Catherine found herself thinking about his words, about the possibility of a different life. And uncomfortably, she found herself wondering if Alexander might be that kind of man. Then she remembered this was all pretense. But when she looked at him, silhouetted against the sky, she felt something tighten in her chest, something dangerous. Over the following 3 weeks, the transformation was remarkable. At the Duchess of Pembroke's soiree, Alexander arrived and immediately sought Catherine, requesting the first waltz in front of everyone. As they danced, people whispered, "Look how he watches her. The third time this week, perhaps Lancaster was wrong." Alexander leaned closer. "It's working. See how they're questioning. They're looking because you're practically embracing me." "I'm maintaining perfectly appropriate distance," he said, smiling. "It's hardly my fault if appropriate seems intimate." But it was the afternoon he invited her to Thornbury House that everything changed. The library was magnificent. 2 stories of books, rolling ladders, tall windows flooding the space with light. Catherine actually gasped. "It's extraordinary." "It's yours," Alexander said simply. "Whenever you wish, consider my library your library. That's the kindest gift anyone has ever given me." They spent 2 hours there, and at one point, reaching for the same book, their hands touched. They both froze. Alexander's grey eyes held hers. "Catherine," he said softly, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "This arrangement. It's becoming difficult to maintain the pretense when I find myself thinking about you constantly. When I realized that somewhere along the way, this stopped being an arrangement and became something real." Catherine couldn't breathe. "Alexander, I know we agreed this was just performance, but I needed you to know that for me, it stopped being fiction weeks ago." "You're just saying that," she protested weakly. "Then explain why my hands are shaking. Explain why the thought of this ending makes me feel like I can't breathe." She saw the truth in his eyes. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Then we'll be terrified together," he said. She didn't consciously decide to kiss him. One moment they were standing there, and the next her lips were on his and nothing else mattered. When they finally broke apart, Catherine rested her forehead against his chest. "This complicates things," she said, smiling. "Terribly," he agreed. "We'll actually have to court each other now." She laughed, genuine and free. 3 days later, Alexander formally called to request permission to court Catherine. Thomas granted enthusiastic approval. "I've seen how you look at my daughter," Thomas said, "and how she looks at you. That matters more than any title." "I love your daughter," Alexander said sincerely, "and I intend to spend my life proving worthy of that love." The Devonshire ball was the pinnacle of the season. Catherine wore champagne silk embroidered with pearls, her hair woven with white flowers. When Alexander arrived, his eyes found hers immediately. "Catherine," he said, "you outshine every star." As they danced, he said, "There's something I need to tell you about my father." "Alexander, whatever it is, it doesn't change anything. You say that now. I say it always. You aren't your father. I love you for who you are." Alexander stopped dancing in the middle of the floor. "I will never tire of hearing you say that." They finished the waltz lost in each other's eyes, but 30 minutes later, a journalist burst through the entrance. "Special edition. Ducal scandal exposed." People rushed for copies. Catherine watched faces change as they read. Edmund Lancaster emerged from the crowd. "Well, well, what shocking revelations. Your Grace, your fortune built on lies and scandal." Alexander turned to face him. "You did this." "I merely revealed truth," Lancaster said. "Truth society deserved to know." His eyes turned to Catherine. "Poor Miss Hamilton. So close to a duchess's coronet." "Enough!" Catherine's voice cut through the murmuring. She marched to the center where they stood. "All of you should be ashamed, judging a man by his father's mistakes, as if none of you have secrets." She turned to Lancaster. "You orchestrated this because you couldn't bear being rejected, because you're a petty, cruel man." "Careful, girl," Lancaster began. "No, you be careful. Because you tried to destroy me, tried to destroy my family, and now you're attempting to destroy the man I love, and I will not stand silently." She turned to Alexander, taking his hands. "You tried to warn me, and I said it didn't matter. It still doesn't. Your father made mistakes, but you aren't him. You're the man who protected his sisters, the man who used his privilege to defend someone weaker." Tears rolled down her face. "You're the man who made me believe in love, and if society cannot see that, then damn them all." Alexander was looking at her as if she were everything. "Catherine, you don't have to." "Yes, I do, because you asked if I would say yes, and my answer is yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stand beside you. Yes, I'll face any scandal, because I love you." The ballroom was silent. Then Thomas stepped forward. "My daughter is correct. We judge your Grace by your own actions, and your actions have been honorable." Eleanor nodded. "You have our blessing." More voices arose. One by one, people who knew Alexander's character spoke up. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Lancaster looked around, realizing his triumph was unraveling. "You'll regret this," he said quietly, but his words lacked force. He left, and the Duchess of Devonshire stepped forward. "Well, that was certainly dramatic, but also one of the bravest declarations I've ever witnessed." She turned to the orchestra. "Music, let us continue." Alexander still held Catherine's hands. "You are the most extraordinary person I've ever known. You've rather ruined your planned proposal," he said, smiling. "There's still a ring." "There is, in my pocket." "Then perhaps the perfect moment is now." Alexander looked around. The ballroom was still crowded. He knelt right in the middle of the Devonshire ballroom. The music stopped. He withdrew a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, a perfect emerald surrounded by diamonds. "Catherine Hamilton, you've seen me at my worst. You know my history, my flaws, and you still chose to stand beside me. You make me want to be better. You are my equal in every way." He paused. "So I ask, before all these witnesses, will you marry me? Not for the title, not for the fortune, but because we love each other." Catherine was crying and smiling. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Alexander slipped the ring on, perfect fit, then stood and kissed her while the ballroom erupted in applause. 6 months later, Catherine Hamilton became Catherine Thornbury, Duchess of Thornbury, at St. George's Church. She wore Brussels lace. When her father led her down the aisle and she saw Alexander waiting, she smiled so widely her face hurt. When they exchanged vows, Alexander added, I promise never to try changing you, to always respect your mind, and to spend each day being worthy of your love. Catherine responded, I promise to always challenge you, support you, and remind you that you are so much more than your title. You are simply the man I love. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Late that night, Alexander took Catherine to the library. There's something I want to show you. He removed a cloth, revealing a newly commissioned portrait of them both in the library, Catherine with a book, Alexander standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder, both genuinely smiling. For when we're old and grey, he said softly, I want to remember exactly how we were at this moment, young and in love, and at the beginning of our story. Our story, Catherine repeated, leaning against him. I like how that sounds. Well, he said, technically our story began with you calling me an arrogant peacock. You were an arrogant peacock. I was, but you made me want to be better, and you made me believe in fairy tales, that true love exists, that equal partners can find each other. So I suppose, he murmured against her lips, we were both extraordinarily lucky. The luckiest, she agreed. And when he kissed her deeply, tenderly, with all the promise of their future together, Catherine knew with absolute certainty that every challenge, every scandal, every difficult moment had been worth it, because it had led her here, to him, to this, to a love that was real, true, and entirely theirs. This was the story of Catherine Hamilton and Alexander Thornbury, the story of courage to say no to wrong things so you can say yes to the right person. True love isn't inherited, isn't negotiated, isn't arranged. True love is chosen. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, sharing it with friends, and writing a comment below. Your support means everything to us and keeps us inspired to tell more stories filled with love, resilience, redemption, and second chances. At the end of this video, you'll find another unforgettable romance from our collection. Click and discover where the next story will take you. With all our appreciation, the Empire of Heart Stories team